Imagine the silence of a library in an ancient monastery, where dusty rays of sunlight shine through narrow windows, illuminating the yellowed pages of manuscripts. Somewhere in the depths of these folios lie stories their authors never dared to tell in their lifetime. Secrets so dangerous that they had to be hidden from prying eyes, written down in secret ink, or simply kept in memory, passed on by word of mouth to only the most trusted people. Greetings, my dear listeners. Tonight, we're going to take a journey through the corridors of the Grand Palace in Constantinople, where behind the purple curtains, dramas unfolded that could outshine any modern thriller. Tell me in the comments what city you're from and what time it is. I'm always interested to know where and when my stories find their listeners. So, close your eyes and travel with me to the 6th century AD, Constantinople, the Second Rome, the city that was called the New Jerusalem and the Royal City, is perched on 7 hills between Europe and Asia. Its marble streets are lined with people in luxurious silk clothes. Gold coins jingle in the hands of merchants, and the air is filled with the aromas of oriental spices, incense from temples, and the salty breeze of the Bosphorus. But if you think you know this history from school textbooks, you are deeply mistaken. Because today, we will talk not about parade chronicles, not about solemn panegyrics to emperors, but about what was hidden behind the gilded walls of the palace, about what one man, a historian named Procopius of Caesarea, dared to write down, but never dared to publish in his lifetime. Imagine this man. Procopius is sitting in his room somewhere in Constantinople, perhaps after the year 548, when he returned from a grueling Italian campaign. Candles flicker in candlesticks. Wax slowly drips down their walls. And outside the window, you can hear the distant sounds of the night city. The barking of dogs, the creaking of carts, the muffled voices of late passers-by. And in this silence, he picks up a stylus and begins to write what would later be called the secret history. What could have made a respectable historian, the author of official chronicles of great military campaigns, suddenly embark on such a risky endeavor? After all, what he was about to put down on parchment could cost him not only his career, but his life. He was going to tell the truth about the Emperor Justinian, the one who would be called the Great by posterity, and whom the Orthodox Church would consecrate as a saint. But Procopius saw this man not through the prism of official propaganda, but with his own eyes. He had witnessed how decisions were made, how huge sums of money were spent on grandiose projects, how ordinary people suffered under the burden of taxes that went to finance endless wars and the building of luxurious temples. And he decided that someone should tell the truth about it. The Secret History is not just a historical document. It is the cry of the soul of a man who could no longer remain silent. It is a pamphlet written in a genre that the ancient Greeks called sogos, total vilification. But behind this vilification lies something more, a portrait of an entire era seen from the inside through the eyes of a man who was at the very center of events. Procopius writes about Justinian not as a great conqueror and legislator, but as a man obsessed with grandiose but often unrealistic plans. An emperor who dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, who threw vast resources into conquering distant lands, while his own empire bled from tax burdens and epidemics. But Procopius paints the portrait of Empress Theodora in even brighter colors. In the official chronicles, she appears as a virtuous co-emperor, a wise counselor of the emperor. But in Secret History, we see a completely different woman, a former actress, which in those days was almost synonymous with prostitute, a woman with a dark past who managed to charm the emperor and become one of the most influential figures in the empire. And here we need to stop and think about that time, about the mores and perceptions that reigned in the 6th century. Byzantine society was extremely hierarchical and conservative. A woman, especially a woman of low birth, had very little opportunity for social advancement. And the fact that Theodora managed to rise from the lowest rungs of society to the imperial throne was seen by many as a violation of the natural order of things. Procopius describes its past in the darkest colors, sparing no detail. But modern historians tend to think that many of these details were exaggerated or invented. The Secret History is not an impartial chronicle, but a political pamphlet designed to smear the ruling dynasty. Nevertheless, even if we discard the most scandalous details, the image of Theodora that Procopius paints remains fascinating. This is a woman of extraordinary willpower and intelligence, who managed not only to win the heart of the emperor, but also to become his full co-emperor. In the laws of the time, we find direct indications that important decisions were made not only by Justinian, but also by the God-loved Augusta Theodora. And this is where the most interesting part begins. Because behind the official facade of Byzantine statehood, there was a world full of intrigue, conspiracies, and secret influences. A world where real power often belonged not to those who officially possessed it, but to those who could skillfully manipulate it from the shadows. One of the most unusual features of the Byzantine court was the enormous influence of the eunuchs. These people, deprived of the possibility of having offspring of their own, and therefore, theoretically, of dynastic ambitions, were considered the ideal servants of the emperor. They could freely enter the chambers of the emperor and empress. They were privy to all the secrets of the court, and it was through them that the real management of the empire was often carried out. Imagine the great palace in Constantinople. It was not just a palace, but a whole city within a city, a labyrinth of halls, corridors, courtyards, and gardens spread over a vast area between Hagia Sophia and the seashore. Silk-clad figures glided along these corridors. Courtiers who spoke in low voices bowed at the right moments and scrutinized the emperor's every word and gesture. But among these figures, the eunuchs occupied a special place. They were recognizable by the softness of their movements, their beardless faces, their high voices. They walked silently, like shadows. But behind this seeming inconspicuousness, there was great power. The eunuchs controlled access to the emperor. They were his secretaries, his advisors, sometimes even his commanders. Fulcarius of Chartres, who was in Constantinople during the First Crusade, estimated the number of eunuchs in the city at 20,000. Even if this figure is exaggerated, it gives an idea of the scale of the phenomenon. Eunuchs were everywhere, at court, in the army, in the church, in trading houses. How did these people get into this position? Some of them were slaves bought in neighboring countries, where castration was commonplace. Such a eunuch slave was worth 3 times the price of an ordinary slave, for he was considered a particularly valuable acquisition. But not only slaves became eunuchs. Sometimes noble families castrated their youngest sons themselves, seeing it as a way of social advancement. One of the most striking examples is the story of the sons of Emperor Romanus, the first Lecapenus. 2 of his sons were castrated as children. One of them, Theophylact, became Patriarch of Constantinople, and the other, Basil, for 40 years, from the year 945 to 985, was the de facto ruler of the empire, remaining in the shadow of the nominal emperors. Think about this story. A father deliberately deprives his sons of the opportunity to procreate, but in return, he opens the way for them to the heights of power. This seems monstrous to us, but in the logic of Byzantine society, it made sense. A eunuch could not become an emperor, but he could become someone who ruled over emperors. And here we come to one of the most secret and at the same time the most important features of the Byzantine political system. Formally, the power of the emperor was absolute. He was considered the anointed of God. His word was law. But in practice, the emperor depended on a complex system of court groupings, interests, and influences. And very often, those who formally did not have any official power, in fact, turned out to be more influential than those who bore high titles. The eunuchs were ideal figures for such shadow power. They could not claim the throne, and thus posed no direct threat to the emperor. But that was why the emperor could entrust them with the most delicate matters, the most important secrets. Gradually, they became indispensable, and after a while, it turned out that no important decision was made without their participation. Of course, this system had its disadvantages. The eunuchs, deprived of the opportunity to pass on power by inheritance, sometimes became particularly brutal in the struggle for influence. They knew that their power rested solely on the emperor's favor, so they were prepared to do anything to maintain their position. Hence, the endless intrigues, conspiracies, sudden ups and downs. But not only male eunuchs played an important role in the secret life of Byzantium. Women, formally excluded from political life, in fact, often had a great influence on the course of events. And here again, it is worth remembering Theodora. Procopius tells how during the revolt of Nika in the year 532, when an angry mob demanded Justinian's abdication, the emperor was ready to flee from the capital. The ship was already waiting for him in the harbor. The treasury was loaded. It remained only to get on the ship and sail to safety. But then Theodora came forward. "I believe," she said, according to Procopius, "that now is not the time to consider whether it is proper for a woman to be bold before men, or to exhibit insolence before those who are afraid. For it is best for men whose affairs have gone to the extreme to consult the circumstances. I believe that running away now is not salutary, even if it will bring safety. Everyone who is born into the world must die, but one who has been emperor cannot become a fugitive. May I not lose this purple, and may I not live to see the day when those who meet me will not call me Lord. If thou wilt flee, it is not difficult. We have plenty of money. Here's the sea. Here are the ships. But be careful that after you're saved, you don't prefer death to salvation. I like the ancient saying that royalty is a beautiful shroud. These words, transmitted by Procopius, may not accurately reproduce what Theodora said, but they perfectly capture the character of this remarkable woman. She was ready to die, but she was not ready to lose power. And her words had an effect on Justinian. He stayed, called from outside the city Commander Velizarios with a professional army, and he made a terrible massacre at the Constantinople Hippodrome, where the rebels gathered. But Theodora's influence extended beyond the turning points of history. She actively intervened in the religious policy of the empire, supporting the Monophysites, those Christians who believed that Christ had only a divine nature. This contradicted the official position of the empire, but Theodora acted so skillfully that she even managed to hide the Monophysite patriarch at court, preventing him from being arrested. Women like Theodora were the exception. But even ordinary women in Byzantium had more opportunities for influence than meets the eye. Yes, formally, they were excluded from political life, could not hold public office, could not represent in court. But in real life, many of these restrictions were circumvented. This was especially true of widows. A widow in Byzantine society had a freedom that a married woman never had. She could run her own affairs, manage her dowry, and engage in trade. Some sources say that widows made up to 20% of the population of the empire, and many of them were very successful businesswomen. But the most interesting thing is how women used informal channels of influence. They could not be judges, but they could influence judges. They could not be generals, but they could influence generals. They could not be emperors, but as Theodora's example shows, they could be more influential than the emperor himself. And this had its own logic. Byzantine society was permeated with a complex system of personal ties, patronage, and mutual obligations. In such a system, formal power was only one of the instruments of influence, and by no means always the most effective. Much more important was the ability to build relationships, create alliances, and find compromises. Women excluded from official politics became masters of unofficial diplomacy. They knew how to influence their husbands, how to arrange marriages between powerful families, how to pass information through informal channels. In their hands were often the threads that controlled the fate of the empire. But to truly understand what lies behind the pages of the secret history, it is necessary to remember one feature of the Byzantine political system, which made the empire unique in the medieval world. Formally, the power of the emperor was not hereditary. Of course, in practice, emperors tried to pass the throne to their sons using the institution of co-empowerment. But in theory, each new emperor had to be recognized by the three main forces: the Senate, the army, and the people of Constantinople. Imagine the hippodrome of Constantinople at a time when the fate of the empire is being decided. The huge structure, capable of accommodating 100,000 spectators, is filled with the roar of voices. On the imperial bed, Katisma, appears a figure in purple robes. The crowd freezes. And then there are shouts of "Axio," "Worthy," or, on the contrary, whistles, and curses. In these moments, not only the fate of one person is decided, but also the future of an entire state. This system made Byzantine politics extremely unstable. Over the 1,000 years of the empire's existence, more than 80 emperors were replaced on the throne, and very few of them died in their beds of old age. Most fell victim to conspiracies, coups, revolts, or simply palace intrigue. Conspiracies and coups were not just frequent episodes in Byzantine history. They were an integral part of the political system. Every ambitious man knew that the way to power was not through elections or appointments, but through skillful intrigue, secret alliances, and skillful exploitation of the discontent of various factions. Take, for example, the story of Emperor Leo V Armenian, who ruled at the beginning of the 9th century. This man came to power based on the army's discontent with the previous emperor. He skillfully used the military discontent, managed to attract to his side key figures in the army, organized a coup. But after becoming emperor, he himself found himself in the same position, surrounded by potential conspirators, having to constantly fear for his life. Indeed, a few years later, Leo V was assassinated by Michael II, the very man to whom he himself had given high office as a reward for his help in seizing power. Michael used the same method that Leo himself had once used. He created a secret circle of dissatisfied people, planned the murder of the emperor, and then declared himself the new ruler. Such stories were repeated from century to century with depressing regularity. The conspirators overthrew the emperor, became emperors themselves, and then in turn became victims of new conspirators. It was a kind of political merry-go-round, where the positions of the participants were constantly changing, but the game itself continued. This logic was particularly evident in the history of Andronicus I Komnenos, who ruled at the end of the 12th century. This man was a true master of political intrigue. He exploited the discontent of the people with corruption and arbitrariness of courtiers, promised to restore justice, punish bribe takers, ease the tax burden. He was supported by the general public, who saw in him a deliverer from tyranny. But once in power, Andronicus himself became a tyrant, even more brutal than those he overthrew. He began mass repression against his former opponents, executed without trial, and confiscated property. Promises of reform went unfulfilled, and the empire descended into chaos. In the end, Andronicus himself fell victim to a revolt that was organized according to the same script he had once used against his predecessors. These stories show us an important feature of Byzantine political culture. Conspiracies and coups were not just a manifestation of individual greed or ambition. They were a structural element of the system. When formal mechanisms for the transfer of power did not work effectively, violence became the primary means of political change. But each conspiracy required complex preparation, careful planning, and skillful coalition building. The conspirators had to take into account the interests of various groups: military, courtiers, church hierarchs, merchants, artisans. It was necessary to find the right moment when discontent reached a critical point, but at the same time, not to let the opponents come to their senses and organize a counterstrike. Consider, for example, the story of Michael Palaiologos' seizure of power in the Nicene Empire in the mid-13th century. Michael was a commander of mercenaries, men who served for money rather than for ideological reasons. When the government began to economize on military expenditure and reduced the salaries of the mercenaries, strong discontent rose among them. Mikhail used this situation skillfully. He did not call for open rebellion. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, he began to campaign quietly among the mercenaries, convincing them that the current government did not value them, that they deserved better treatment. Gradually, a circle of loyalists formed around him, ready to support him in a decisive moment. When the right opportunity presented itself, Michael acted quickly and decisively. He seized key positions in the capital, arrested his main opponents, and declared himself despot. Everything happened so quickly that the resistance simply did not have time to organize. But the most interesting thing about this story is how Mikhail managed to legitimize his coup. He did not simply seize power by force. He managed to present his actions as restoring justice, as saving the state from incompetent leadership. He appealed to traditional Byzantine notions that a true emperor must be not only strong, but also a just ruler. This ability to turn a political coup into an act of restorative justice was a characteristic of many successful Byzantine conspirators. They realized that simply seizing power was not enough. They also had to convince society that this seizure was necessary and justified. Various techniques were used for this purpose. The deposed emperor was accused of tyranny, corruption, heresy, and treason against the interests of the state. They told about prophecies and signs that allegedly heralded the change of power. They attracted church hierarchs to their side, who could give the coup a religious sanction. A particularly important role in these processes was played by the so-called hippodrome parties, blue and green. Initially, they were just groups of fans supporting different teams in chariot races. But gradually, they turned into serious political forces, each of which had its own ideology, its own leaders, and its own social base. The blues traditionally supported orthodoxy and imperial traditions, and were supported by the wealthy urban population. The greens more often sympathized with the monophysites and were more radical on social issues, supported by artisans and the urban poor. But this division was not absolute. The parties could change their positions depending on the circumstances. Any pretender to the imperial throne had to gain the support of at least one of these parties. Ideally, they would be able to unite them under their banners, as happened during the Nika revolt under Justinian. Then, blue and green, for a while, forgot about their differences and stood united against the emperor. Nick's revolt was one of the most serious political crises in Byzantine history. It began as a simple riot after a racecourse race, but quickly escalated into a real coup d'etat attempt. The rebels proclaimed a new emperor, seized much of the capital, and set fire to many government buildings. Justinian found himself in a critical situation. His advisors insisted that he leave the capital and try to regain control of the situation from the province. The ship was ready, the treasury was loaded, the evacuation plan was worked out. And then Theodora came forward with her famous speech that royalty is a beautiful shroud. But Theodora's words would be just a beautiful phrase if there was no real force behind them. And that force was a professional army under the command of Belisarius. While the masses raged in the streets, the imperial troops remained faithful to their oath. And when Justinian ordered to suppress the rebellion, Belisarius carried out this order with ruthless efficiency. The terrible massacre at the Hippodrome, where thousands of rebels were slaughtered, was a turning point not only in this particular conflict, but also in the history of the Byzantine political system. It showed that ultimately, power belongs to whoever controls the army. The masses may revolt. The parties of the Hippodrome may plot. The courtiers may weave intrigues. But the final word rests with those who hold the sword. This logic became determinant for all subsequent Byzantine history. Successful conspirators always relied on the support of the military. Unsuccessful pretenders to the throne were most often defeated precisely because they failed to attract the army to their side. But the army is not a monolithic force. It consists of different parts, each with its own interests, its own commanders, its own corporate culture. The capital troops were different from the femme troops, the regular army from the mercenaries, the infantry from the cavalry. A skillful conspirator had to take all these nuances into account, find approaches to different groups of military men, and build coalitions that would be strong enough to seize power. Take, for example, the story of the Paleologos dynasty's rise to power in the 13th century. Michael Paleologos, managed to become emperor, not because he was the most noble or the richest candidate, but because he understood the mood in the army better than anyone else. He started out as a mercenary commander, knew the problems of ordinary soldiers, and was able to speak to them in their language. When Michael decided to seize power, he did not rely only on his mercenary troops. He managed to find allies among the officers of the regular army, among the commanders of the navy, even among the palace guards. He promised each group what it wanted to hear: mercenaries a pay rise, regular troops better conditions of service, officers rapid promotion. And when the decisive moment came, all these promises worked. The coup went off almost without bloodshed, because Mikhail had neutralized potential resistance in advance. He did not just seize power. He came to it with the support of the very forces that were supposed to protect it. Such stories were repeated again and again in Byzantine history. Each successful coup was the result of long and careful preparation, skillful coalition building, and precise timing. And each time, the conspirators used the same basic techniques, playing on the discontent of various groups, promising improvements, appealing to traditional values, finding religious justification for their actions. But the paradox was that once in power, the new rulers faced the same problems as their predecessors. Promises made to the allies had to be honored, but the state's resources were limited. The various interest groups continued to fight among themselves, and the new emperor had to balance between them, trying not to offend anyone definitively, but also not to let anyone get too powerful. Sooner or later, new contradictions accumulated, new discontent arose, new conspiracies were formed. The wheel of history turned, and yesterday's conspirators became targets for new pretenders to power. This was the peculiar tragedy of the Byzantine political system. It produced bright, talented, energetic people capable of great deeds, but it also condemned them to a constant struggle for survival, to the need to think not about the long-term development of the state, but about how to stay in power tomorrow, next week, next month. And maybe that is why Procopius's secret history sounds so modern, because it tells not only about specific people of the 6th century, but also about the eternal problems of power, about how the ambitions and passions of individual people affect the fate of entire nations. And so, reflecting on these eternal cycles of power, we return again to the figure of Justinian and to that epic, which was so vividly and contradictorily depicted by Procopius in his secret history. Because Justinian's reign was not just another episode in the succession of Byzantine reigns. It was an attempt to turn the tide of history, to restore the lost greatness to the world, to restore the empire to its original boundaries. Imagine a man who wakes up every morning thinking that he is called to rebuild the Roman Empire, not symbolically, not in dreams, but in reality, to reclaim Italy, North Africa, Spain from the barbarians, to restore Rome's power over the entire Mediterranean. It was just such a man who sat on the Byzantine throne in the first half of the 6th century. Justinian was a visionary in the fullest sense of the word. He saw before him a grandiose picture of a restored world, where a single empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to Mesopotamia, where a single faith united all peoples, where a single law governed the lives of millions of people. And he was ready to throw all the resources of his state into the realization of this grandiose dream. Justinian's wars began in North Africa, ruled by the Vandals, Germanic tribes who had conquered these rich provinces in the 5th century. A Byzantine army under the command of Belisarius landed on the African coast and defeated the Vandal kingdom in a brilliant campaign. Ancient Carthage became a Roman city again, and the African provinces returned under the emperor's rule. But that was only the beginning. The next target was Italy, where the Ostrogoths ruled. Here, things got much more complicated. The Gothic wars stretched on for many years, turned into a grueling struggle that devastated the once flourishing country. Cities changed hands, armies marched back and forth across the peninsula, and the civilian population suffered from constant warfare. To these difficulties was added another calamity, Justinian's plague, an epidemic that swept across the empire and claimed millions of lives. Procopius describes the horrors of this epidemic, how people died in the streets, how there was no one to bury the dead, how whole cities were deserted. Modern historians believe that this pandemic was one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. But even the plague did not stop Justinian. He continued wars, continued building, continued reforms. The main symbol of his epoch was the new Cathedral of St. Sophia, a grandiose construction that was to outshine all the temples of the world. When the cathedral was consecrated, the emperor uttered the famous words, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Indeed, Hagia Sophia was an architectural marvel. A huge dome, as if floating in the air, marble columns brought from all over the empire, mosaics that took your breath away. This temple became more than just a religious building. It became a manifesto, a declaration that Byzantium was capable of great deeds. But behind all this splendor, there were enormous costs, which placed a heavy burden on the population of the empire. Procopius writes about how Justinian squeezed money out of his subjects, how new taxes were imposed, how officials plundered the provinces. Secret history is full of accounts of how people went broke, how ancient senatorial families lost their wealth, how the provinces became empty from the tax burden. And here we come to the main paradox of the Justinian era. On the one hand, it was a time of great achievements, military victories, architectural masterpieces, legal reforms. Justinian's code became the basis of European law for many centuries. The conquered territories were returned to the empire. Saint Sophia stood for 1,000 years as a symbol of Byzantine greatness. But on the other hand, all these achievements came at a terrible price. The empire was torn from the strain of overstrain. Conquered territories had to be held by force, which required a constant military presence. The population dwindled due to epidemics and wars. The economy was undermined by excessive taxation. After Justinian's death, his successors were unable to hold on to all the territories he had conquered. Italy was lost when the Lombards invaded it. Much of Spain was recaptured by the Visigoths. Even in North Africa, the Byzantine presence gradually waned. But the strongest blow to the empire came from the east. In the 7th century, Muslim expansion began, which in a few decades deprived Byzantium of most of its territories. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, all these rich provinces came under the rule of the Arab caliphs. Only a Balkan Anatolian splinter remained of the great Mediterranean empire. And in this new reality, many of those institutions that had played an important role in classical Byzantium began to lose their importance. The eunuchs, who had been pillars of imperial administration for centuries, were gradually pushed into the background. Under the Komnenian dynasty in the 11th to 12th centuries, they were still numerous at court, but no longer reached the pinnacle of power. Fulcarius of Chartres, who visited Constantinople during the First Crusade, still estimated the number of eunuchs in the city at 20,000. But these were no longer the omnipotent figures who, in earlier times, had actually ruled the empire. The Komneni preferred to rely on kinship ties, creating a complex system of family clan, where key positions were held by representatives of the imperial family. And after the restoration of the empire in the year 1261, when Michael Palaeologus recaptured Constantinople from the Latins, the eunuchs finally lost their position. The Palaeologists looked upon their physical features as a disadvantage, and the entrenched idea of hereditary transmission of power made the previous precautions unnecessary. This change reflected deeper processes that were taking place in Byzantine society. The empire was becoming more traditional, more conservative, more similar to other medieval states. The cosmopolitan spirit that had made early Byzantium unique was disappearing. Complex court intrigues, were replaced by simpler and more straightforward family ties. Women, too, were losing the opportunities for influence that they had had in the classical era. Late Byzantine society became more and more patriarchal, more and more closed. Women's education was limited to the very basics: reading, writing, numeracy, psalms. Literacy among women fell from 16% in the 14th century to less than 2% in the 13th. But perhaps the most important change concerned the very nature of power in Byzantium. If in the early period the emperor was primarily the head of state, in the late period he became the head of a dynasty. Power was passed on by inheritance. The younger members of the imperial family received high titles and lucrative positions, and a complex hierarchy of family ties was created. This system was more stable but less dynamic. Gone were those bright figures who could rise from the bottom of society to the top of power, thanks to their talents and ambitions. The place of Theodore and Basil Bolgoroboitsev was taken by more modest, more predictable rulers. And when in the year 1453 Mehmed the Conqueror's cannons blew a hole in the walls of Constantinople, it was not only a military catastrophe, but the end of an entire civilization. A civilization that had been able to combine Eastern opulence with Western rationalism, Christian piety with ancient wisdom, strict hierarchy with social mobility. But the memory of this civilization is preserved not only in historical chronicles and architectural monuments. It is preserved in the secret stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, in the tales of people who knew how to play the most difficult game in the world, the game for power over human souls. The secret history of Procopius is only one such story, but it opens a window to a world that was full of passions and contradictions, nobility and meanness, greatness and pettiness. A world where every day events that could change the course of history could happen. A world where people lived with full commitment, sparing neither themselves nor others in pursuit of their dreams. And maybe that's why these ancient stories are still able to excite us, because they tell us not about strangers in strange times, but about the same passions and aspirations that drive people in all eras, about the thirst for power and love, about betrayal and loyalty, about how great ideas are realized by imperfect people. Procopius of Caesarea died probably in the 560s, never having decided to publish his secret history. The manuscript lay in the archives for many centuries until it was discovered and published in the 17th century. It was only then that the world learnt the truth about the golden age of Byzantium, a truth that was complex, contradictory, but no less fascinating. Today, when we live in an age of information transparency, when every move of political leaders is covered by the media, it is hard to imagine a time when the truth could have been hidden for centuries. But maybe that is the special value of works like Secret History. They remind us that behind any official facade lies a living human reality, full of passions and contradictions. And when we close our eyes and imagine those distant times, the flickering candles in the marble halls of the grand palace, the rustling of purple robes, the muffled voices of conspirators, the clinking of gold coins in the hands of merchants, we touch that eternal thing that binds all human generations. To the desire to understand the meaning of what is happening, to find our place in the world, to leave a trace in history. Good night, my dear listeners. May your dreams be full of amazing stories, and may tomorrow bring new discoveries. See you in our next night journeys through the labyrinths of history, where every turn may reveal to us a new mystery, every page a new riddle of the human soul.